Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Arturo Paz wash processed Honduras from Aoma Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Aoma, based out of Osaka, Japan. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel. As they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. We picked this coffee up from Airworks as part of their February coffee drop, as it felt like a great opportunity to add another Japanese-based coffee roaster to our catalog for our eventual Asian coffee roaster tier list. So it'll be interesting to see how this coffee turned out, as this right here is day 46. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Aoma's recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 92 degrees Celsius, about 197 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. This one is much more along the lines of coffee roasters that we've had from Japan in the past, as this one definitely skewed a little bit more on the developed side of things. And when you compare it to another Japanese-based coffee roaster that we had recently reviewed on this channel, which was of course Apollon's Gold, this one definitely still skewed a little bit more developed than that coffee, and certainly more so than what we usually review on this channel. I feel like a lot of people would align this one with being on either the slightly lighter side of a true medium or on the much more developed side of that medium light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 20, first impression through the V60, and that was the immediate takeaway that I did have from this coffee, as a lot of the more roasty qualities were abundant right at the forefront, with a slight bit of the listed caramel on the back end. That was certainly the most prominent aspect of this coffee outside of the more roasty and developed qualities of it. In line with the expectations though for a more traditional Central American coffee, as it definitely had more of that developed Japanese profile to it, so as a result it was an okay first impression. Day 23, through the Chemex, and there were similar struggles this time around, as it does continue to remain marred by the development of the coffee. Pretty traditional Honduran coffee otherwise, as it definitely had a bit more of a bold and robust profile to it, with the primary note continuing to remain that caramelized aspect. There is a slight peachiness on the cool down and finish, as this coffee does open up ever so slightly, but for the most part it continues to offer that classic Honduran feel. Day 26 through the April brewer, and the coffee was the best it had been to this point, which did lead to the idea that it's probably going to be better with some lower extraction adjustments, as it has seemed to help with some of the more developed qualities of it. Peachiness as a result was a bit more prominent, with it being presented in a slightly subdued Central American sense, with plenty of the sweetness coming from the caramel once again. So I would say a upgrade at this time, but even then not necessarily overly in line with my own preferences. Day 29 through the V60 with Aoma's recipe, and it's only moderately helped the coffee, as there's a bit of a trade-off with notably less of the roastiness, but the stone fruit qualities have become a little bit less pronounced as a result, leading to a much more traditional experience yet again, with notably less intensity overall. And that's usually the trade-off when we do make these sort of adjustments, but I said there's a fair bit of the roasty quality that we do need to tone down on this one, and I think it's a trade-off that might need to be made. Day 32 through the Chemex with Aoma's recipe, and this was possibly the best it had been to this point, as it has certainly helped mitigate a lot of the roastiness, while the listed peach does feel a little bit better defined as a result, so that trade-off definitely felt a bit more worth it this time around. We move on to day 35, as we opted for the V60 with Aoma's recipe, and I felt like we might need to revert back to our standard recipe if we're going to continue brewing it with the V60, as this didn't necessarily seem to help, as it continues to have a bit more of a focus on the roasty aspects. I'm well aware that our water was probably far too soft to brew a coffee like this, as I didn't really know what the profile of this coffee was going to be going into it, having no familiarity with this roaster, but I think the takeaway pretty early on was that our water wasn't really well suited for working with this coffee. Fruit qualities mitigated a fair bit too much, and the amount of roastiness was continuing to remain a bit more prominent, and this time around it didn't even feel quite as subdued as it had the previous time we had brewed it with this recipe on the V60, so not necessarily the best results. We move on to day 38, as we opted for the Chemex with Aoma's recipe, and the coffee was back to being at its best, which I feel like perhaps that's due to the fact that the Chemex does have a bit more coarse of a grind, and I think that certainly helped, as there's much more of a sugary stone fruit aspect this time around. It still has plenty of texture to it as well, so you weren't necessarily trading off too much in terms of the body, so a lot of the, we'll say, more traditional aspects are still felt, but at this time you're just getting a little bit better defined of a fruit quality to it. Day 41, final notes we have through the Chemex one more time with Aoma's recipe. And the coffee was the best it had been to this point, as it felt like it's offering a nice combination of this time. We have a lot more notes listed: honeysuckle, dark grape, some lightly colored citric qualities, of course being orange and tangerine, and some lightly colored stone fruits in a more sugary sense. Also some very slight baking spices and nuttiness, which are much more in line with the traditional aspects of a Honduran coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a couple level 4s. Let's go through those real quick. And we'll start with the finish, level 4. The finish in this coffee is definitely on the more traditional side of things, as this one did skew on that more developed profile. And I think as a result, I would say more often than not, you're getting an abundance of those chocolate, nutty, spiced qualities to it. So I don't necessarily think I have too much to add to that. Just think of that more what you would expect for a more developed Central American coffee. Sweetness level 4. This is a bit of a redeeming quality for this coffee, as I did find it to have some very nice sweetness to it, and the other coffee we're discussing from this coffee roaster also seemed to have that. So I want to give credit to them for that. And I've heard people say in the past that Japanese coffee roasters can skew on the more sweet side of things, which I have mixed impressions of. I feel like it's a case-by-case basis, but in this case, I think that maybe this coffee roaster was going a little bit more for the sweetness with their coffees, but don't necessarily know for sure. Level 4 where we opted to put it, as most of it's coming from that caramelized aspect. We move on to level 3s. We have a lot of them. We'll start on the other side of the tasting wheel with the acidity level 3. Not necessarily the brightest coffee. I don't think on paper and in theory this coffee had any potential to ever score at that level 4. A little bit more developed of a Central American Honduran Pacas coffee. That certainly isn't going to lead to a brighter profile to it. Florality level 3. I mentioned a slight bit of a honeysuckle-like aspect to it. Wouldn't necessarily say it was always the most abundant or pronounced quality within this coffee, but present enough to score at that level 3 mark. Spice, level 3, mentioned a fair bit of those baking spice qualities to it, very much in line with the Central American coffee, so we can move past that to the saltiness, level 3. Also mentioned some slight nutty qualities to go with that, as well as you're seeing a lot of the traditional profiles within this coffee at play. That includes the berry fruit, also there at that level 3. I mentioned some darker grape aspects to it. And then the citrus fruit, also there at the level 3. All of these fruit qualities I wouldn't necessarily say are the most abundant, defined, or pronounced qualities within this coffee. They are all presented in that slightly more subdued Central American sense, as is the case with the stone fruit, which I know is the only fruit notes that they did have listed here on this coffee. And I can see it. Of the fruit qualities we've mentioned, it's probably the one that's most pronounced. Could be the priming effect, or it could just be that that's what this coffee was skewing a little bit more in the direction of, but even then, level 3 is where we opted to put it. Chocolate level 3, definitely I would say a little bit more still of, we'll call it a lower percentage cacao, darker chocolate aspect, because it doesn't have that very strong, heavy, smoky chocolate quality to it. Even though this coffee is a little roasty at times, it's still, I would say, on the verge of being a little bit more milk chocolate-like. Caramel level 3 definitely had plenty of those caramelized aspects to it, and that's another quality that they had listed on this coffee. So what was it? Stone fruits and caramel, and yeah, it was pretty abundant. I would say if anything, it's the most pronounced quality within this coffee. Smokiness level 3, we'll just dive right into that. Yeah, it was pretty developed, and we don't score too many coffees at that level 3 for smokiness unless it's really pronounced to the extent that it was in this coffee. And that's what we're insinuating with the profile. And I'm still not necessarily saying it reaches that point of where it's just so medium that the smokiness is overbearing and too much within a coffee. I'm thinking of the Christmas coffee that we had from Leuchtfeuer, which was definitely on that side of things. Savoriness level 3. A fair bit of those nutty qualities were presented within this one. So once again, that's that savory note on this one. Body level 3. Even with the Chemex, it still had plenty of texture to it. So that does insinuate that if you were to brew this with another brew method, you're probably still getting a higher level of body and texture to this coffee. And then the final and most important thing worth discussing, the cleanliness level 3. That is an example of this coffee being slightly marred by the more smoky qualities to it, because I think that that did take away from the overall definition and clarity of this coffee, leading to a downgrade at that level 3 mark. Outside of that, I would say the fruit qualities, yeah, they are present. The caramelized aspect definitely present, so you can see a fair bit of cleanliness to it, no funkiness or fermentiness taking away from it too much. So as I am looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I don't think it'll come as a surprise to anybody that this one wasn't necessarily in line with my own preferences. Perhaps a slight bit more developed than I would have necessarily enjoyed going into it. And even outside of that, I don't necessarily always have the best results with Honduran Pacas coffees in general. So while I did find this one having some nice components to it in a slightly more balanced sense, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's something that I would seek too often. And that does lead into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. And I feel like this is in line with the much more traditional coffee drinker, as it's pretty well balanced and it doesn't score too heavily in a lot of the less desired qualities for people that do like that more true coffee taste to it. So just a little bit of brightness, a little bit of that fruit aspect, but outside of that, the main components do remain that coffee-like taste. And in addition to that, that chocolate, caramelized, and more nutty base and quality to it, while still presenting a higher level of sweetness. So definitely some positives to take away from this one, but I feel like that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Arturo Paz wash processed Honduras from Aoma Coffee. Thank you for watching.